everybody doesn't feel the same way as I do, and that's fine.
66.6 FM.
It's not your daddy's radio station.
Radio free. Episode 222. So a lot of times I just kind of come up with ideas for episodes when I'm screwing around doing random stuff. Such was the case with this week's. You see, there's this country out there called Korea. They're right by this other place,
Almost across the pond, one might say.
called Japan, and I've done a whole bunch of episodes about Japanese heavy metal bands over the years. Haven't really done much with any Korean metal. I happen to know a decent amount about black metal from there, and when I was doing research for some upcoming episodes about that topic, I got curious. I was like, I wonder if there's any more 8-gui albums than the one I have, Forest of Ghost. And I go on the internet, look it up, find this thing called Korean metal albums on YouTube, and it turns out they do have another full length. I was like, hell yeah, brother. I happened to scroll through that channel a little bit more thoroughly, and I started seeing release dates on some of these Korean metal albums being like 1991, 1990, 1980, whatever, and I'm like, wait, they had metal there in like the 80s?
약간 잡다한 것들이 다 들어.
What? I'm sorry.
I did not know that.
And so, of course, that sparked a furious amount of research on my part. Ended up listening to a whole bunch of this stuff at the gym for weeks and weeks, and that is how we find ourselves where we are today. So you're thinking about the origins of Korean metal in the 80s, and you're probably thinking it's going to be a lot like how Japanese metal was in the 80s.
That's where you're wrong.
See, it turns out old school Korean metal has a very distinctive identity to it. Like a lot of musical scenes, there is sort of like a core group of bands that initiated stuff, like with American thrash metal, you got the big four, Megadeth, Slayer, Metallica, and
군기반장을 잘할 수 있어.
Fine, Anthrax.
That's no good.
The German thrash metal stuff, you got Creator, Sodom and Destruction, Visual K in the 90s, you got Malice, Miser, Lacrima Christi, Fanatic Crisis, and Shazna. It's like that with Korean metal too. You got a big three. The first of these three, the oldest, way back from 86, would be Sinaway, who played a very epic, mid-paced variety of heavy metal, which bears some resemblance to what Black Sabbath were doing around the mid-80s, specifically in their utilization of what I have affectionately termed the Eye of the Tiger bass line. The standout element of their first album, apart from like the very epic lo-fi guitar sound and mid-paced tempo, would have to be the vocals, which are very soulful, emotional, and heartfelt, but are also very gruff and abrasive. Pretty unique sound. Sort of like what you might expect from Lemmy if he tried to sing for a power metal band. The song you're listening to right now is entitled Nam Samdang Pe, which refers to a location where you would go to see street performers do all kinds of wacky artistic stuff, dating back to the Shilla Kingdom in ancient Korean history. If you were unaware, division and strife in the Korean peninsula did not just start in the 1950s. If you go way back to the BCs, there was actually 3 kingdoms that made up the peninsula, Shilla, Pekche, and Goguryeo. And Sinaway sings a whole lot about that sort of historic and folkloric kind of stuff. A similarly historic and folklorically focused band would be the second of the big 3, a band called Baekdu-san, named after the Baekdu Mountain, which rests on the border of North Korea and China and holds a lot of historical and cultural significance for Korean people. But where Sinaway kind of had this really doomy, like rough around the edges feel to them, Baekdu-san is way more in line with 80s metal. And by that I mean it's much more conventionally heavy sounding. There's a whole lot more thrash and a whole lot more power metal to it. And the vocals are a lot more crazy sounding and way more shrieky and 80s sounding, as you're hearing right now. Unlike Sinaway, there's not just one dedicated lead vocalist that does all the vocals. Every member of the band sings at some point, and that allows them to do a little bit of this kind of stuff. Thrash metal gang shouts, but it also lets them do something even more interesting, where they can come out of those gang shouts into these really cool, like, layered choral harmonies. Not really something you hear in a lot of this kind of hard-edged thrash metal. And personally, I find it to be a very interesting approach to metal vocals. So both Baekdusan and Sinaway are great bands, and when I do other episodes on Korean metal, I'm going to discuss both of them more because they both feed into a couple of other bands I want to talk about in the future in terms of giving them different band members. But my favorite band out of the big three is the band that this episode is mostly going to be about, and that is,
부활.
What?
부활.
Pual?
이번에 처음으로
What? It's not my fault. It's Romanized. It looks like it should be saying Buwal, but then the computer robot lady's making a P sound. I don't fucking know. But luckily, they also put their band name in English on all their albums. Born Again. That's a lot easier for my substandard American linguistic skills.
You're an inspiration for birth control.
That's not nice. Anyways, Born Again, Puwal, whatever the hell you want to call them. They are by far the band out of the big three that has really captured my imagination over, I don't even know how long, the past month and a half at least. Because in many ways, they are the lightest band of the three, but they're also kind of the heaviest, and they're definitely the weirdest. They are way more 70s sounding than the other two bands, to the point where I would describe the way they arrange their albums as almost being like an inverted version of Budgie. If you don't remember Budgie, they are like one of the oldest heavy metal bands, going way back to the early 70s. Metallica covered them. And they're a great band, but they also kind of piss me off, because a lot of times they'll put like a big heavy single at the beginning of the album. And yeah, it's fucking great, but then the next song they hit you with, and you're just sitting here like, God fucking damn it! What happened, man?
This sucks.
Born Again are like the inversion of that, where their albums start off really ethereal and floaty sounding and then gradually build up to being really heavy and catchy. And honestly, they do the weird floaty ethereal stuff way better than Budgie.
Shots fired! Shots fired!
A big part of why they succeed in doing this sort of thing is the guitarist and main songwriter Kim Tae-won is so talented. He's able to take these like softer moments and do something interesting with them, in addition to when he starts cranking out the heavy riffs later on. His style is very interesting in that it's very lead guitar heavy, but the way he plays lead guitar, it's almost more like a kind of a riffing rhythm thing. Even when he's doing the weird solo-y stuff, because you can hear it kind of spiderwebbing around the rhythm chords. The hardline distinction between lead guitar and rhythm guitar doesn't really exist in this band the same way it does in a more conventional heavy metal band. It's very Pat Travers. Part of what makes this unorthodox approach to heavy metal songwriting work for him is the adept drumming of Hwang Tae-sung, who is very good at adapting the different kinds of beats he uses to all the weird stuff that he's doing on guitar. Vocals are sort of a hybrid between the Sinaway and Baekdusan method. There is definitely a lead vocalist, in this case Lee Sung-chul, who later on left Born Again to sort of become an important proto-K-pop figure. He wrote the song Girls' Generation that the famous girl group is named after. But then this other vocalist comes in with these much gruffer vocals. I don't know what band member it is, but I love them. And he kind of duets with the main vocalist, and it's super fucking neat. It gives this real like grit and edge to this very Korean style of heavy metal ballad song. You can tell that they're building up to something heavier. See, this song is very early in the album. These guys have a lot of progressive rock in their blood, and that means they really pay attention to how they arrange songs on the album. So they start off pretty light, gradually bringing in heavier elements. By the time you get to when the album gets heavy, it hits all the harder for it because of that buildup. Speaking of progressive rock, check out this sort of gradual introduction of different instrumental elements. Starts out with just the drums right there, very minimalist, bringing in that heavier bass, and then one layer of guitars followed by a whole nother layer of guitars, and they're sort of like moving over each other, which is very interesting in sort of like a round fashion that then resolves itself in a harmony before it then dissipates into just the bass and the cymbals, followed by a dramatic reemergence of all of the instrumental layers. The guitars here are super strange. This almost sounds like a traditional metal version of the kind of guitar riffing you would hear on the first At the Gates album. You see what I mean when it's hard to distinguish between solo and riff? Because right now that lead guitar layer is bouncing melodies off of the rhythm line. But now they're synced up, and it just like vacillates between those two poles so effortlessly. And he's using so many weird techniques too, this sort of like palm muted arpeggio thing over top of these really heavy backbeat riffs. That is strange, but it's also awesome. This album is endlessly entertaining for the discerning guitar listener. In a way, it reminds me a lot of Loudness in that he's using all of these complex techniques. In Loudness's case, it was all the weird intervals. In the case of Kim Tae-won, it's his propensity for contrapuntal density. But with both bands, they do all this weird shit, and you don't even notice how weird it is because of how tight the songwriting is. To the undiscerning ear, Loudness would just be any other 80s heavy metal band. To that same undiscerning ear, Born Again would just be like a very good 70s rock band, but there's so much more to it than that. If Kim Tae-won is the Alf Svensson of traditional heavy metal when it comes to his rhythmic riffing approach, as far as his lead guitar tone goes, he's the Trey Azagthoth of old school heavy metal. Just really weird, liquid, bendy, messed up solos that somehow work within the music still. The heaviest song on the album is the fourth track, entitled Lovers on the Street in English, and this one features vocals almost exclusively from whoever the gruffer voiced guy is, and it's probably the closest they ever get to the more conventionally 80s strains of like thrash metal and power metal and speed metal. But I mean, we're talking about conventional in terms of a Born Again song, so it's still wacky. This song heavily relies on Hwa Tae-sung's skills as a drummer to make weird beats that go over this weird interpretation of what a thrash metal riff is. I feel like I'm headbanging, but it's in a sideways figure eight or something. Just really odd riffs suspended in lead guitar soup. Here's another example of lead guitar also being rhythm guitar. He's got this repeated tapping figure in this like bizarre satanic inversion of like a party heavy metal riff. Right into something that almost sounds like the Hangar 18 riff, but years earlier and a whole lot stranger, with these weird little guitar accents and flashes. And then check out this crazy transition into the solo section, just repeating those last two notes over and over until they fold in on themselves into another rhapsody of Tony Iommi meets Trey Azagthoth, a wild explosion of guitar sounds, incredibly off-kilter, and yet it works within a heavy metal context. Well, you could probably play this for your dad, and if he could get past the Korean vocals, he'd dig it. That's the kind of stuff you can expect from the first Born Again album, the wonderfully titled Rock Will Never Die. The second album that came out with this lineup was also their last of the 80s and kind of the last of the heavy metal era of Born Again. It was entitled Remember, and it's structurally somewhat similar in that it starts off very light and builds up to the heaviness. But this one goes even harder on the prog and like the weird atmospheric shit. The first three songs on this album, not only are they pretty long individually, but they're actually all part of like one long 3-song suite that has interconnected ideas. Hey, did you put a Vangelis album on?
어플로 주문을 하던가?
No, I'm just screwing with you, but this album is much more keyboard heavy. It's also a lot more subtly produced. You could definitely use this one to test a sound system. It all has a very mystical sound to it. It starts out being quite a bit lighter than even the lightest moments in the prior album, but don't worry, it does get heavier. And the vocals on this album are particularly impressive, with a lot of cool of those weird rough-edged harmonies like the one you just heard. So this is Remember 1. There is also Remember 2 and 3. Remember 1 builds up to this like stirring emotional climax with that very sick liquid lead guitar leading into the most morbidly heavy moment of the album. The centerpiece of not only the song Remember 2, but the entire album. This incredibly spooky sounding, weird messed up riff with the cool keyboards under it. Perfect stuff. Into this odd thrashy transition, which then defies expectations. Because you think this is going to be building up to some crazy neoclassical power metal section. But Instead, you get this really clever inversion and counterpoint to that initial spooky riff there. These arcs of melodies being placed in a terraced construction that would almost be Baroque if it wasn't for the very jazzy drumming and funky bass work. If you thought that my theory that this guy's the trad metal Triassic though theory seemed kind of wacky, check this shit out. This is just bizarre, and it's awesome, especially the way it winds itself around those keyboards. Seriously, this is like Altars of Madness of 70s dad rock. But the way he digs himself out of this hole of Yog-Sothothery is just as interesting. Going back into that sort of mystical trudge and stomp from earlier in the song, this time with added wordless lead vocals. You see what I mean when the fact that the drums and the guitars are so adaptable is what makes these very long-form songs work without sounding too off on the wall. Speaking of walls, unfortunately, Boo Wall, Born Again, they kind of broke up after this. Everybody in the band produced like a whole lot of solo projects, and then when they sort of came back into a new configuration in the 90s with pretty much all new members except for the main songwriter, they were definitely more sort of like soft and rock and rolly, less of that weird spooky metal shit. But those two 80s albums they did gave me more than enough to chew on, and I would highly recommend both of them. And there's a lot more cool stuff to be found in the old school Korean heavy metal scene. Expect to see more episodes on other bands from that era in the future. Hopefully you find this stuff as interesting as I do, and even if not, I hope you enjoyed the episode. If not that, thanks for listening to the end anyways. I appreciate it. See you next time.
The electrons.